Books on Tape presents To Have and to Hold by Jane Green, read by Kate Redding. For Harrison, Tabitha, Nathaniel, and Jasper. Prologue. This is a story about Alice Chambers, who moved into a house that once belonged to the writer Rachel Danbury, and who in doing so discovered something about herself, her marriage, and her capacity for love, who changed her life. Rachel Danbury was a writer who moved to the town of Highfield in the late 1930s. Long after Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald spent a summer in the neighbouring town of Westport, Rachel was part of a thriving artistic community of ex-Manhattanites who had escaped to the suburbs and beyond, looking for a more relaxed, peaceful way of living. She wrote 2 novels that disappeared without trace, but her third, The Winding Road, caused a huge scandal. A scandal that ultimately forced her to move away from the town she loved to a place where nobody would know who she was. For Rachel Danbury wrote about her life. She wrote about her marriage, about her womanizing husband Jefferson, and about her love for a man named Edward Rutherford. She wrote about a small town in Connecticut called Highfield, about the people who lived there, the people who considered themselves friends. She exposed the town and its inhabitants with warmth and humour, but with dangerously sharp accuracy, and they never forgave her for the betrayal. Rachel Danbury tried to ignore her husband's infidelities. She told herself he was simply possessed of extraordinary charm, but when he had an affair with a woman called Candace Carter, a former starlet for Paramount and owner of the town theatre, she could no longer pretend she didn't know what was going on. Rachel sought solace and revenge in the arms of Edward Rutherford, a neighbour who had always been pleasant, had always been willing to stop for a chat, and until Rachel set out to successfully seduce him, nothing more. But Rachel and Edward fell in love, and eventually Rachel had to make a choice between a love that was more meaningful than anything she'd ever known and her husband. She chose her husband. And for the rest of her life Rachel learned to turn a blind eye. She learned to switch off the light in her bedroom, trying not to think of the fact that her husband was not lying beside her, trying not to think about where he was, or whom he might be with. The story of Rachel and Jefferson became famous in America in the 1940s. Everyone in Highfield knew the people involved, and for years the house in which Rachel and Jefferson lived, even after Rachel sold it, was thought to have a curse. Does history repeat itself? The cottage changed hands several times, and then Alice Chambers and her philandering husband Joe moved in. And this is where Alice's story starts. 1. December 24, 1996. Alice takes a deep breath as she opens the closet door and pulls out her dress. She lays it carefully on the bed, gathering her shoes, her veil, her stockings and garter, draping them gently next to the dress, amazed that in just a few hours' time she will be wearing all of this. In just a few hours' time she will be Joe's bride. "Here comes the bride," she sings to herself, taking small gliding steps down her hallway into the kitchen, smiling despite the butterflies, putting on the kettle to make herself another cup of coffee. She thinks she needs the coffee to stay awake, so badly did she sleep last night, but the adrenaline is already pumping, and she's waiting for Emily, her maid of honour, to arrive, someone with whom she can share the excitement. Walking back into the bedroom, she stands for a while gazing at the dress. While not exactly what she would have chosen, she can't deny its beauty, how elegant it is, how impossibly stylish. Alice had always thought she would have a country wedding. She dreamed, even as a little girl, of a small stone church, of walking through a white wooden gate in a soft feminine puff of a dress, fresh flowers in her hair and a bouquet of hand-picked wild daisies in her hand. The groom had been unimportant. Her fantasy had ended at the church door, but she knows the groom, even in her fantasies, would never have been as handsome or as successful as Joe. At university, when she and Emily sat up late into the night, discussing their knights in shining armour, Alice said she thought her ideal man would probably be an artist, or a craftsman, or a gardener. She had laughed as she said it, laughed at the unlikeliness of any lasting relationship, let alone marriage, given that her longest relationship at that time had been 3 weeks. And before meeting Joe, her longest relationship had been 3 months. "Not a good record," she had groaned to Emily when they were both planning on growing old together. "Means nothing," Emily had reassured. "Once you find him, you'll be married for life. Me? I'll probably get divorced after 6 months." Alice had laughed, but even as she laughed she was thinking she wished she could be more like Emily. Emily who didn't want to settle down, who was quite happy, flirting and flitting from one boy to the next, who claimed to have been born with a fatal allergy to commitment. So a country wedding with a group of smiling toddlers. She had hoped that by the time she got married, if she ever got married, someone somewhere would have been able to provide the smiling toddlers, throwing down a blanket of rose petals and giggling as they walked up the aisle behind her. She had envisaged a sea of straw hats and floral dresses, the sun beating down on her bare arms as she emerged from the church, hand in hand with her other half. When Joe proposed, she had told him about her dream wedding, and he had smiled at her indulgently and said it was a lovely fantasy, but they couldn't possibly get married in the country when both of them lived in London, and anyway didn't she agree that winter weddings were so much smarter? She didn't agree, but felt she had to, because after all Joe was paying for it. Alice's parents didn't have a penny, and Joe was determined to have a wedding that he judged fitting for the head of the healthcare business in mergers and acquisitions at Godfrey Hamilton Salts. They would have a lovely old Bentley to drive them to the church. Bye-bye shire horses and lovely old carriage. She would wear a simple but elegant gown, so long, cream puff of a dress, and a friend of his who was a jeweller would almost definitely lend her a stunning diamond tiara for her hair. See you later, fresh flowers. So Alice went through the motions of planning her wedding. Every evening she would tell Joe of her decisions, and every morning she would have to phone florists, dressmakers, photographers, to inform them that actually she'd discussed it with her fiancé and the plans would be changing. Would they mind terribly, she would say, if instead of pretty mauve hydrangeas and tulips, they had dark red roses and berries? And not the dress she had designed with a tulle skirt to rival anyone in Swan Lake, but a sleek, simple sheath of a dress with long bell sleeves and a matching coat. Joe had flicked through some bridal magazines and showed Alice what would suit her. And so sorry, but actually they didn't want informal fun pictures as they had discussed, but formal family groupings that would take place during the reception. Alice drains her coffee and steals a quick glance in the hall mirror to confirm what she already knows. Deep bags under her eyes, proving that last-minute nerves are not just an old wives' tale. Alice has spent the night tossing and turning, fear rising up in a wave of nausea, common sense trying to push it back down again. After all, isn't she the luckiest girl in the world? What woman would not want to marry Joe? Joe with his winning smile and easy charm, his broad shoulders and playful humour. Joe who could quite feasibly have married anyone he wanted, and he chose Alice. Alice! Men like Joe did not usually look at women like Alice, or if they did, it was one quick, curious glance followed by instant dismissal, for the Alices of this world held nothing for men like Joe. The only child of adoring parents, he had been brought up to believe he was God, his mother's fault, to believe that every woman would fall in love with him, his mother's fault, and to believe that a woman's role in life was to do whatever Joe wanted. Naturally, his mother again. Even now, on her wedding day, Alice feels like she has to keep pinching herself. 30 years old and used to unrequited crushes on men who never seemed to notice her, Alice didn't seriously think she'd ever find her other half. She might have had her dream wedding in mind, but in truth she was secretly convinced she would grow old with her cats, a kimono-clad spinster who would surround herself with eccentric people and end up living vicariously through her younger, prettier friends. Alice has always thought of herself as rather plain. Everyone who knows Alice has always thought of her as rather plain. She was the shy, mousy girl in the playground who was always last to be picked for teams, and even then she knew she was only ever picked because it was a choice between her or Tracy Balcom, and Tracy Balcom had flat feet, and B.O. Alice was left until last because no one ever seemed to notice her. At age 14 she had become known as Wallpaper, a name that would be said with a snigger, although frankly it never bothered her. She quite liked the fact that she faded into the background, that she could watch her classmates and think her thoughts without anyone ever bothering her. It only started to bother her when she discovered boys. Up and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?